Welcome to another episode of the Denison Forum podcast. I'm Dr. Mark Turman, host for today's conversation. Sitting down with some of the team from the Denison Forum, have Mark Legg, who you've heard before. Mark is associate editor for Denison Forum. Say good morning.
Good morning.
Yep,
Yeah.
Glad to have you. Mark is recently married, so we may want to get into that topic as well.
Maybe not.
He's still very much in the honeymoon phase, right?
Yes, I would say so.
You would say that. Would she say that?
Yeah, I hope so. Yeah.
Yep. Okay. So we're celebrating with him. We also have today Josh Miller, who is creative director for Denison Forum and Denison Ministries. Josh is also a teacher at one of the area churches here in the Dallas area and wears a lot of different hats, also is a musician and is a writer. We're going to talk today about a book that he's working on and that is available to you called Peace in Politics. And we'll get into that in just a moment. But Josh, say good morning.
Hey, good morning. Yeah, glad to be here.
Yeah. So we're kind of a little bit bleary-eyed. We had a big event for the Denison Forum last night, and we're all still kind of recovering, slept in or tried to sleep in, and a little bit tired today, but we'll make the best of it.
Drinking lots of coffee too.
Yes, drinking lots of coffee. And wanted to kind of kick things off. We try to not take partisan positions at the Denison Forum, and we'll not do that here. But we have been talking in recent days about what the midterm elections will be all about, what will be on people's minds. The media is already driving a lot of these topics. So I wanted to ask you guys to kind of react to what I think will be the top 5 things that people are thinking about going into their voting booth this time. The first one I lead with is just all things Donald Trump. Whether you love him, whether you hate him, whatever stance you might have, he seems to be in every single political conversation that you can get into today in one way or another. And that whether you talk about recent events surrounding him and his home in Florida, all that, it's just this big thing called all things Trump is one big bucket item. The second one is somewhat related, but it actually involves both political parties in a substantial way, which is this issue of election integrity. Can we really trust this process that we're all going to go and vote like we always do and that the outcome of it is legitimate? We've written on this. We've done a podcast on this in a few months back. You can find all of that stuff through our website at denisonforum.org. But election integrity is fundamental, and it is a very, very divisive issue right now. What I've listed as the third one may actually be the first one in many people's minds, which is just the economy and inflation, what we're paying for gas, what we're paying for food. I don't know about you guys, but when I go out to eat these days, it's like the hamburger I used to pay $6 for, I'm now paying $10 for.
Yeah, it's a bit shocking sometimes.
Yeah, and I actually had the experience of going and getting a burger, fries, and a Coke, and it cost me $20.
Yeah, wow.
And it was not a $20 hamburger.
Yeah.
And so anyway, the economy is a big, big deal. I think foreign affairs are more important now than they've ever been in our minds because of things like the pandemic. We now know that travel and technology can bring stuff from around the world to us in short order. And that certainly happened with the pandemic. So I think things like Ukraine and what China's trying to do in this, that, or the other area is much more of a concern than it used to be. And then the last one is just related to abortion and abortion rights because of what happened through the summer with the overturning of Roe v. Wade, the Dobbs decision, that type of thing. Depending on where you might be in the country, that seems to be bubbling up into a larger conversation. So that's my 5. And I put them in order so you can challenge my 5. You can rearrange the order. You can add 2. What is your reaction?
Man, I think that your 5 are correct. I think in terms of which order, it's hard to say right now. I think it changes by the day. From my perspective, it seems like the news organizations in particular are kind of poking and prodding to see what's going to get people most activated. So if you're looking at kind of right-leaning news sources, they're poking and prodding around certain issues to find out what's going to make people both most afraid and most angry, I think.
Right.
And then on the left side, you're seeing the same thing. That's why I think Trump comes up a lot on left-leaning sides, is because he makes for a great villain in some cases as well, and brings people out to vote against him. And so I think depending on where you stand politically, certain people are going to find different issues being the most prominent in their own lives, because they're certain things that are more kind of triggering to them or bring up more fear to them. And so they'll find those issues becoming most prevalent, For me, on my day-to-day, I feel the pain of inflation right now on a regular basis, like you're saying, going out to eat or going to the grocery store. Things are coming out more expensive than they normally would, where on a day-to-day basis, I'm not really thinking about Trump. Now that, Roe v. Wade was overturned, I'm not thinking about that every day as well. And so it's interesting to me to kind of watch how all these news sources kind of pivot to try and find what's going to drive the most attention, So I think it'll be interesting to see what happens over the coming months as we're getting into midterms and past midterms, what the narrative is coming from both sides. But
Right. Yeah. And something that you hit on that we've talked about with David French before, who's a commentator, a cultural and political commentator, is that it seems more and more that parties are not discussing what policies they're putting forward, but kind of instilling fear of what the other side will do if you allow them to be elected. And so just like you said, the narrative on each side is becoming more and more about, okay, if you're right-leaning, the top priority is going to be something like the economy, because it's something everyone can feel, and it's something everyone is upset about as well. And so they're going to press in on that. If you're on the left side and you have your own worldview that includes abortion as a fundamental human right, that's going to be something they say, look, this is already at risk, clearly, for them. And so you just see more and more it's about going against the other side rather than for something in particular. And so with that said, I think you're right. They're still touching on, okay, I think it's pretty solidly the economy, it seems like, for the right-leaning sites and thinkers. And then it's more to do with Trump as always, it seems like. But we'll have to see how it plays out. I think your list is great, and I think it's right on. But maybe we could start by talking about the fear and how it's become more about, you just see it in political ads even. It's about, hey, this is what this other governor is doing.
Right.
This is what, Jim even talked about it this morning, I think, how there's more and more governors becoming, their political ads are targeting other governors of states, things like that. So if you guys want to comment on.
Yeah, and I've heard Dr. Jim talk about this a number of times. If you want to gain attention or you want to raise money, there's kind of this 3-step process of, number one, you need to convince people that they have a threat or an enemy, that there's something they really need to be afraid of. And then the second step is that they can't solve that problem. They can't overcome that threat on their own. And that number 3, if they will elect you or you will give them money, or they will give you money, that you can help them overcome the threat.
Yeah.
Right. That's the way you get their vote. That's the way you get their money is, hey, let me identify this threat that is overwhelming to you. Let me convince you that you can't handle it on your own and you need me. So elect me and give me money.
Yep.
And that's the way many of this fear process often works in our culture. And you just kind of see it. And then and kind of related to this, Mark, of what you're talking about, is that really is a big struggle for me is just of all the things that we're suspicious now of in our culture, being suspicious of the media, which is where we get our information and understanding about any of this.
Yeah.
We're not in Washington. We're not in our state capitals. We're relying on this bridge called the media to tell us what is happening and how we ought to understand and think about all these things. But there's now widespread distrust of media.
Yeah.
So then you're like, well, how do I know what is even remotely accurate to talk about, right?
Yeah. That's on both sides of the aisle, that distrust is, by the way. Yeah.
Yeah. And I felt that tension over the past few years myself, of feeling like I need to read or watch all the sources just to create some kind of aggregate that feels like it's fair and not biased in some way. And I think a lot of that, and we can get into this in more detail if you want, but a lot of that is due to the way media has changed over the past couple of decades to where things were coming from subscription-based news sources, newspapers, or a few more unbiased, news programs on TV. Now the news media is primarily a digital news media, which means instead of having primarily subscribers pay for the news to be created, you're paying for the newscasters through your subscriptions. Most of their revenue is now being driven through advertising. That it is now their business model to get clicks, not to inform accurately. And so you see that on both sides is they're asking the question, what is going to drive the most traction? And unbiased, moderated news is not the right answer to that question, right? It's going to be things that are kind of fear-inducing, things that feel kind of blown out of proportion, things that even might have half-truths in them, or kind of intentionally biased perspective, or at least a biased headline, are going to be things that get more clicks, which then in turn get more ad dollars, which then propagates this cycle. And so I think there's good reason for why I think news media now is not trusted like it was, because I think people are starting to see through the behind the curtain a little bit in terms of, you guys aren't telling the full story here. You're trying to get me to bite, right? It's always this baiting type scenario with news sources now. And so it really is challenging to find places that are coming at this without that underlying motivation to get you riled up, which is why I think what Denison Forum is doing is so important. And it's not that we don't have our own bias and motivation. Everybody brings a bias to the table. Right. Ours just isn't biased towards a political party. Ours is biased towards biblical truth, right? And so we don't hide that. We're not trying to get around that. People know what we show our cards there, but everybody has some sort of bias. And so it's important for us, even as we're consuming news from whatever source, to understand the bias that news source is coming from. If I watch or listen to Fox News, I know what their bias is and what they're trying to sell me. If I watch CNN or read New York Times, I know what their bias is and what they're trying to sell me. And if I consume Denison Forum, I know what our bias is and what you're trying to sell me. And that, to put it in kind of rough terms there, but it's important, whatever source we're engaging with, to understand what is the agenda here, what is the motivation here, so we can kind of right size that and maybe try and undo some of the bias, or at least understand, you're coming from a bit of a skewed opinion here.
And that's part of the real challenge of this, right? Because when you start talking about, and we've all heard Jim talk about this as well, about, okay, well, you're just going to need to aggregate your news. Well, I've actually tried some of this, tried to work on this and worked with various sources to try to do this. At some point, it just feels like it's just too much trouble. It's just, okay, now I need to go listen to 2, 4, 6 different, I need to try to pull all of this together. And then I need to listen to it all or read it all. And then I need to blend it all together and come up with what I think. That just sounds way more overwhelming than what I have time to do on a daily basis. And so the temptation then becomes, I'm just checking out. I'm just, I don't care about all of this, and God's bigger than all of this anyway. So I just walk away from it in that standpoint, which is not a healthy thing to do. And then the other thing, Josh, what you're talking about is, none of us ever knew that this subtle change in the way that journalism works actually happened. When I was a kid, I had a paper route and I sold subscriptions. And I would suspect in the longer run of history and media and newspapers, many of these news outlets, particularly going back to the newspaper, when newspapers were dominant, they had leanings. They certainly had leanings. But they were more subscription-based with advertising on top of it. And now we flipped it around. And now, the people in business will tell you the number one job of being in business is to stay in business. And in the media world, in the journalism world, you have to sell ads. To be able to generate revenue, to stay in business, to hire your people, and to do anything. You just have to stay in that world of selling ads, which is driven by clicks. Okay. And none of us realized when that model flipped over. And where the advent of 24/7 news cycles and news outlets came, and they are competing with each other. No question they're competing with each other. I just keep wishing, especially when we come around to things like election time, that they would just be open and just say, this is the perspective we come from.
Yeah.
Right.
And because, as you said, there's been a lot of work done and more work probably coming of people pulling back the curtain and saying, okay, this is where this outlet is really coming from. And I would just wish they would just say, hey, this is who we are. And when you come to us, you're going to get this perspective. And if there's somebody out there that can crack the nut of aggregating for us, we might probably hold them in suspicion as well.
Sure.
But that might help us all out a lot if we could, because everybody wants to tell you, no, we are an objective news source.
Right.
Right.
Yeah. I follow, there's a couple of tools I use. One is All Sides, which All Sides does, one thing they report on is they will show you different headlines from different sides of the spectrum. So first thing they do is they will evaluate where they sit on the spectrum, and then they will show you one piece of news kind of with their sides presented alongside it. So like you said, we might be suspicious of them as well, but I think they do a pretty good job. And then another one I follow will show you what percent of everyone who's reported on it is of each side, right? Because there is bias in how you report something, but there's also bias in whether you report it at all.
Right.
Right. And so especially for those stories that push a narrative forward, for instance, when there was a really tragic story about a girl who was like 10 years old who was pregnant and wanted to get an abortion, and she couldn't. I don't know if you guys remember that story or not.
I do. Yeah.
And so Jim wrote on that and things. But when you looked at who reported on it, essentially very, very few on the right side reported on it at all.
Right.
And you can find that for the left as well. So it's interesting that it's not only what you're reading, but also kind of this blindness, this intentional blindness to things that you don't agree with. And what I appreciate about Denison Forum is that I feel as a writer, I feel the freedom, again, because yes, we want to get this out to a lot of people. Obviously, that's what we're trying to do, but we're also, we fundraise. Like, we don't have to put ads on our articles. We don't have to closely try to scrape every last second of page view that we can from someone and we want to write well, but we don't want to write in that way so the fear thing works, and we could talk more about your book talking about fear, I think, and how we can find peace in politics, because the reason why people get at fear is because they're trying to sell attention. Okay, they're trying to get our attention. So what's the best way to get someone's attention? Fear. So if I see like a tiger in the bushes, okay, and I'm just like out in the open in like some kind of, Sahara setting, like that activates my amygdala so much that it overrides everything else.
Right.
Because I'm literally going to die if I don't make, you know what I'm saying?
Right.
And so activating that in the most efficient way possible. And by the way, we're doing it now with computers, that artificial intelligences, algorithms that are literally designed to do that for you. I mean, that's just crazy to think about in and of itself. And you think, wow, that's a bit of a bleak picture. So yeah, I think there is some feeling of hopelessness in that, like when you look at what's really going on, but at the same time, there are tools. You can take a step back. And so how do we combat fear, Josh, and what have you looked at in Peace and Politics? Yeah,
well, I think you're hitting on something really important, that it's that fight or flight response. Right. Mm-hmm. And you even mentioned it. There's either this like, let me hide and run away from this.
Just forget about this. Yeah.
Or let me go attack the threat. Right. And so that's what the news is trying to get out of us to some degree, is this, they want us to get polarized, both politically, get more in that corner you're in, and both attack the person who's responsible for the chaos, quote unquote chaos that's happening right now. And so what I think our call as Christians is to get beyond that.
Yeah. I remember, so I read a book a couple of years ago called Factfulness by Hans Rosling. He talks about that human beings are drama addicts.
Yep.
That we get addicted to drama and we see drama. It's one of the reasons we watch certain television shows is why is it that we always have a police show, a hospital show, a lawyer show, a fireman show? Why is it? Because we're caught up into the drama of, well, that could happen to me. And what would it be like if I was caught up into a situation like that? And so we're kind of drama addicts. And then politics and the news kind of drive us and keep us in that. But Josh, tell us a little bit before we get into some of the details. What was the motivation behind writing this?
Yeah.
Who was it just cathartic for you? Were you targeting a particular audience? What brought about this writing project?
Yeah, it really was cathartic initially. It was started writing this around our last election, really because I found myself caught up in that drama. I was trying to, listen to these different news sources. Both left and right were saying, if this person gets elected, it's the end of the world, essentially.
Right.
It was the first time in my life I had experienced an election where the stakes felt so high, and I didn't feel like I chose that or tried to step into that drama, but I think maybe it was just starting to have an awareness of politics, even and kind of listening to these news sources for kind of the first time. I started experiencing a ton of anxiety around it, both not knowing what to do, not knowing who was right, internally conflicted around really seeing issues on both sides. As much as both sides were promoting that this is the godly way, some people would say that by voting Republican, you're voting how Jesus would vote.
Right.
And then I'd hear I'd have friends on the other side saying, no, but if you actually have to vote Democrat to vote like Jesus would vote, because he would care for the least of these, or, all these, there's both sides of this. And experiencing that kind of drama, both internally and relationally with people for the first time in my life, I just had all these questions of how do I wrestle with this? How do I process this? How do I walk in a sense of peace and trust in the Lord in a season that feels like it's impossible to find? And so I honestly this started as me journaling
right.
around, okay, what's true? What's actually true in this season? Why am I experiencing this anxiety? How do I have these conversations with people that I don't even know if I agree with or disagree with? I had unknowns, or even how I felt to where I didn't know how to have a conversation where I could stand on a position with as much confidence as some people were standing on positions. Really started wrestling with all these questions internally, knowing that it is not of God for me to be walking in anxiety in the political season. Right. But that's not
that anxiety is not from him.
Exactly.
Yeah. So let me frame this for our audience just a little bit. Just that we're a multi-generational podcast today. Okay. So we'll frame it this way. What was the first presidential election you either did vote in or were old enough to vote in? So for me, the first one is Ronald Reagan. I go back that far. So, because what brings this to mind is what you said a moment ago, is just being energized around this in a way that you hadn't been energized around it before.
Yeah.
So, Josh, first presidential election you could have voted in or know that you did vote in? Yeah,
it was the one where Obama's first presidency was that first election. Okay. But even in that stage, being in my early 20s, I didn't even have hardly an awareness or care, frankly. Yeah. I don't know if it was just that stage of life for me, or I was also traveling a lot at that stage. So it wasn't heavily even watching the news much at that point. So I had an awareness that it was going on. I don't honestly remember if I even voted.
But not a deep engagement.
Correct. Yeah, correct.
Yeah.
Mark?
And I'm going to get totally roasted for this, but I think it was the 2020 election, because I think I barely missed the 2016 election.
Okay.
So That is pretty multi-generational.
Yeah. So now everybody knows who the old guy is in this conversation.
Right.
But what do you think, Josh, if you look back on that now, what do you feel like generated so much of the anxiety, so much of the tension?
How would the world change if Christians led the way in civility? Can we learn to disagree agreeably with those who don't share our faith? Can we speak the truth in love without sacrificing either? Cultural theologian Jim Denison discusses these topics and more in 2 books we're releasing in our Let's Be Civil book bundle. For a limited time and for your donation of $50 or more, you may request this bundle of an updated print edition of How Does God See America and an immediate digital download of Respectfully I Disagree, How to Be a Civil Person in an Uncivil Time. You may also request only the print edition of How Does God See America for a donation of $10 or more. Visit dailyarticle.org today to request your books.
Yeah, what the first realization I had as I started to process this was that we've put politics in the wrong place in our lives. And it started with me personally, that I was putting so much weight on what happened in the election that it started to feel like is my future at stake type election. And who am I putting my hope in this election? And so I began to realize that we've at some point, and was seeing this in the church, said that politics and who was running our country had more weight on the future, our own future and security than even God. So it was really, I think, kind of usurping God's authority and his role in our lives in that season, to where I was going, okay, I don't know if I'm really trusting God to take care of me, that he has my future, that he holds our nation. It was, well, if Trump gets elected, how does that affect my future? How is my security? And so it was a lot of this wrestling where I first came to terms with, okay, something is completely out of whack here. From the very foundational thing is out of whack here, to where we are putting way too much stock in who the president is and not ultimately realizing who our ultimate authority and security comes from. And I saw that in the church. That was honestly one of the most maybe frustrating and also uncomfortable things for me, was seeing this not only play out in the secular arena, but even in churches.
Can you give us some examples? Because we saw this equation start to emerge at multiple levels of our lives and of our culture around this interplay of anxiety and anger, right? Mm-hmm. This kind of big umbrella of tension, but anxiety and anger. And one of the things I learned from a family counselor years ago is that anger is usually a mask for fear. It's usually a mask for anxiety. Mm-hmm. And when we get afraid, mm-hmm. we either will run away, the flight mentality, or we will fight. Mm-hmm. But what's behind it is we're angry because we're afraid, and we're mm-hmm. angry that we are afraid, or something mm-hmm. or somebody has made us afraid. Yeah. And that becomes part of our response to that. So what did you see that in congregational life or within other relationships? What did you see manifestations of either the anxiety or the anger, or the two of them working together? Yeah, and you're totally right. Anger is always a secondary emotion. So whenever mm-hmm. we're experiencing anger in some sort, it's important for us to stop and go, what's the root of this?
Mm-hmm. There's a source. Yeah.
Some of my most angry times usually came from insecurity, where right. I got either embarrassed or was uncomfortable or worried about how I appeared. That was my personal struggle, especially my youth, of am I looking bad? Or am I coming across poorly? And then I'd get angry if somebody contributed to me looking bad. And so initially I only understood the anger, and that person was bad for making me look bad. Right. Until I, took some time and some therapy to understand that actually I'm just really insecure about these things and need to work on that. But I saw this play out in the church, where a lot of people weren't doing that processing, going, why am I angry? But instead just found the villains, the people to be angry at. And unfortunately that was turning to other people in the church, which was the most sad part of it for me, was to watch people worshiping together on Sunday morning and then on a Tuesday evening viciously attacking each other on Facebook. And I'm going, how do these two things go together?
Right.
How are we the family of God, loving one another, here to serve his kingdom, trusting in him, putting our hope in him, and then on Tuesday evening calling each other names because they disagree on a political issue? It was really just disorienting for me to see this kind of disconnect. And this, I think there was this season where people became almost split in who they were. They had this church life where we were about God and we were for him and wanting to live for him. And then we had this political life where we were acting like different people and had different priorities.
Yeah, kind of the worst expression of compartmentalizing.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
It's like, hey, we're like this on Sunday and Sunday morning, but we're going to be like this Sunday afternoon or Monday night on our keyboard.
Yeah. And we all live that to some degree, right? I mean, I've seen that before in terms of, we talk about giving our money on Sunday, but then we're very consumeristic on the weekday. There's always obviously full integrity is where we're the same person all the time in all places. And so there's always, I think, we all lack a little bit in that way. And it's always a pursuit to, we want to be integrous people everywhere we go. But I had never seen such a dichotomy, and one that turned so vicious, to where it was not only that we're not quite living in an integrated life, but we're also going to attack anybody who thinks differently on not even what I would call the main most important issues. So it was a very disorienting season for me. And so, I was writing that book both to find some sense of inner peace and kind of a true north of what is true in this season, and to kind of right size politics, to be able to come to the place of saying, regardless of what happens in this election, I know that my hope and my trust is in Jesus. Honestly, that was part of the step. I had to get back to that, to say, regardless of what happens, God is in control, which had gotten flipped to where it wasn't feeling that way in my day-to-day life. So that was the first part of that process for me. And then the second was, how do we get the church back to a place where we can all say that together collectively, that regardless of what happens, we are still the body of Christ. Right. And to get to a spot to where we can actually be a place where we have disagreements amongst each other and still not have those be divisive. Can we exist in the same place, worship the same God, live for what's most important, even if we don't agree, even on something as, I would say important as like a Roe v. Wade issue, as an abortion issue. Right. Obviously a big deal issue, but there are people in our churches that think differently about that issue. Can we be in relationship? Is it possible? Is it possible to have conversations with one another, to love each other, even if we strongly disagree about what is the right thing?
Are we going to take an all or nothing position?
Is there a right time to take an all or nothing position? These are the kind of questions I was wrestling with in that season.
And especially with politics, because it's one thing to say that abortion is a moral wrong. It's definitely not part of following Jesus. Like, we can have a lot of those answers that are much more clear from Scripture. We can still potentially, like you said, disagree on them, even though we have strong thoughts about them. But obviously, we have taken a position at Denison Forum on that. But there's an extra step even in the political side, because it's not self-evident. I mean, you could make the straightforward case, well, it should be illegal. It's murder. Okay, and I think there is some truth to that kind of argument. But at the same time, another believer may have a different idea about the politics aspect, even if they agree about the abortion itself, right?
It's complex.
Right. Yeah. So something that you could touch on at some point as well is like the humility aspect, because I find myself, the more I study, the more I think it is shocking that people have such strong opinions on things that are so complex.
Yeah.
You have that curve, right? Where you start to learn about something. I don't know if you guys have see this, but like you start to learn about something and you have a high confidence in your opinion. And then the more and more and more you learn, the less and less confident you become because you learn there's so many different sides to something. And then you start to slowly get that back, but it's over years that you slowly get that back. And so it is, I think that may be where the anger comes into play is people actually aren't as confident as they think about their political opinions, but they put it out there very strongly. Mm-hmm. Like, I believe this. And then if someone pokes a little hole in that, because it turns out they actually haven't done as much research as they thought they have, that's where the insecurity comes in and then the anger comes in. Yeah. And by the way, I'm talking about myself here,
Sure. Yeah. And because the lack of certainty actually makes us more anxious.
Yes.
Right.
That's right.
And so we feel like we have to say it strongly and express it and claim clarity even when we don't have it, because the lack of certainty makes us more insecure and leaves us feeling unmoored. It makes us feel like we don't know what's going to happen yet. But I love what you're saying about, many of these things that we've had some really significant divisiveness within families. I don't know if you guys experience this on a family level or among friends within the congregation. I heard somebody say a few months back, what we've learned is that many of our congregations have been held together by political ideology way more than theology. Mm-hmm. And this is it didn't cause it, but it exposed it and has brought it out. But, even on a family level, having experienced that, and then trying to figure out, well, how do we work our way through this? But when you start talking about scale, and this is, again, where we get back to some of the problems and opportunities relative to the media, we are talking about a country of 335 million people.
Yeah, right. Very diverse country.
A very diverse country of 335 million people. And we're talking about a world of more than 6 billion people.
Right.
And we ought to be, as Christians, concerned about every one of them, not just our little group of people, but we ought to be concerned about, is this good for the people in Australia or Bangladesh or China? Are we trying to build a world that's just good for us or for me, or are we trying to build a world that's really good for everybody? Well, the Christian perspective would be, how do we think about everybody in this?
Sure.
And when you start thinking at scale, then it gets even more complex.
Right.
Right. On a political basis and that type of thing. And yet we want to claim, and maybe the media drives us in this direction in some way, that, oh no, I have clarity because I heard XYZ person report on this, and that must be the way it is. Yeah. So I'm going to claim absolute certainty on something I have minimal information about.
Yeah, and it's also an ought or should that's implicit in that, because you don't just say, there's reporting on this, but then you add the extra layer of interpreting, and then the extra layer of saying this is how it should be applied. And like you said, in this scale where you're talking about at federal level, you're talking about laws that apply to a clothing designer in New York, and to a rancher in the middle of West Texas. Mm-hmm.
Right.
Okay. So think about, are you really so confident that the best laws that could incorporate that many people? And obviously there should be a grounding to morality, and morals are universal in that sense, but the application of politics is still another step, that's tough to wrestle with for sure. And there's an ought, it's not just this is what happened, but there's a this is what should happen, and that's complex.
Yeah, but I think the humility point is huge,
right?
Because I think when you become prideful and arrogant, you think my way is the right way. Mm-hmm. And I think you've already lost to some degree.
Yeah.
Because I think we've already probably oversimplified an argument. We've probably are seeing it from a particular worldview, maybe seeing it from the rancher in West Texas and not thinking about the person in New York.
Right.
We've likely oversimplified if we're going, this is the one and only way, this is the right way, this is the perfect way, and every other way is wrong. Now, again, there are moral conversations, and even on those clear moral issues, the application of how you actually put that into practice can be different. So even like, which I don't know if this was on your list, but the like immigration issue would be another that's been rising up to the surface right now, that especially on the right side, that's being promoted as this is the, this is going to be the end of the U.S. if we don't solve this immigration issue, and it's all the left's fault, right? So even on an issue like that, I think all of us from a moral standpoint would say we need to care for those less fortunate than us. Right. Obviously from a biblical standpoint, from a secular humanist standpoint of let's care for those less fortunate. There's a biblical standpoint of caring for the least of these, caring for the poor. Obviously we are called to do that. But then you start asking, but how do we do that? Right. Is there a moral way to do that? And I don't think the answer is yes. I think there are lots of different ways that can apply. And so even if we have something that from a moral standpoint, we feel really solid and secure on, from a political standpoint, the way we apply that or try and approach the problem can be very complex. Is it the role of the government? Is it the role of the church? How is it the role of the states or the federal? Those are all very nuanced conversations and questions, all have pros and cons to them in terms of application. And so even if we can agree on a moral point, we may find ourselves disagreeing on the actual application. And so again, it comes back to that humility around, I don't have this all figured out. Right. I'm obviously trying to honor the Lord in what I'm doing and make the best decision I can, but there is still conversation to be had in how this actually plays out.
Yeah. One of the things that made me think when you're talking that comes to mind is I've recently been working through and even teaching from John 9, where there's a story of Jesus walking through this community and sees a man born blind. Yeah. Okay. And part of the foundation of the story is nobody had ever heard of someone who had actually been born blind getting their sight for the first time. And Jesus performs this miracle. But it starts off in this conversation. Jesus sees this person, points him out, and the disciples who are closest to him say, well, whose fault is it? Did the man sin somewhere? Like before he was even born, did he sin? Or what I think was more likely their conclusion, well, his parents must have sinned, and now that's why their son was born blind.
Right.
And I love Jesus's response. Eugene Peterson paraphrases it this way. He says, you're asking the wrong question. And what we should be thinking about here is how can God be glorified in this man's life and in this situation that he finds himself in? And then he goes forward with the miracle and all that. But it made me just think, particularly in a lot of our conversations around political issues in our families and around our country, is that we're just trying to figure out, well, who do we blame? Because once we've come up with the explanation, we can be done with this.
Yeah.
We don't have to go into the further steps like in immigration of, okay, well, what are we going to do? We have tens of thousands of people at the southern border trying to get into our country because their situation in their country is so bad that they feel like they have to pay a cartel $10,000 for 3 attempts to get across the border, because if their choices are go home to what I was in or pay this $10,000, I'll pay the $10,000. And having some understanding of that and trying to find compassion in that. Whereas a lot of times we're kind of like those apostles. No, we just need to figure the problem out, assign blame. And then once we've assigned blame, we can just walk on and absolve ourselves of any more involvement. Because, well, that's just their thing. That's not our thing. No, it's our thing.
Yeah.
And sometimes we just don't want to get that far in. We don't want to get that involved. We would just like to come up with an explanation that we can sleep with.
It's a lot easier when we dehumanize others. Right. That's what the news is trying to do as well. Yeah. The news is not trying to help you see people. They're trying to help you. They're trying to call it an issue, And so as Christ followers, what Jesus did that was so different, he saw people that others wrote off as an issue, right? Yep. It's just a blind guy, somebody's fault, not worth my time, where Jesus stopped and saw a person. And I think that's our call as believers, is to say, this may be, the news may be trying to call this some kind of major issue. It's just numbers. It's just data. It's just this. But it's people,
right?
It's people, children of God, and one of the questions we ask in the book is, what do you think of when you think of somebody on the opposite side of the political aisle? How do you see them as an opponent, or do you see them as a child of God? Because I think that's what I was witnessing in our churches is all of a sudden they were no longer brothers and sisters in Christ. They were now just the enemy, blank, generic enemy. It wasn't an individual with their own experiences and their own backgrounds and their own pain that they've walked through that may be shaping their own worldview. There was no place for nuance or understanding or seeing the person.
Let me chase that out with you for just a second from the standpoint of, because one of the things I've been thinking about in this area is we've even gone so far as to say they're not simply my enemy, they're evil.
Yeah.
And from a biblical standpoint, when you start getting into this category, and Dr. Jim and I had some conversation about this as well. When you go that step, okay, and you turn this into a good versus evil kind of an equation, you're in a different sphere. You're in a different category.
Yeah.
And we seem to have gone there in rapid order, that if you vote for this person, you're not just wrong, you're supporting and engaging with evil.
Yeah. And you're trying to put God on your side too. It goes back to that humility issue, right?
Yeah.
If they're evil, then I am right. I am good.
I am holy.
Yes. Yeah. So it's dangerous, right? Not only to vilify others, but what that does in you to say, no, I know what's right. I'm in the right, is a really dangerous path to walk.
And it feels like, and would love you all to comment on this, it feels like to me at times a very flippant theology of evil. A very dangerous way to handle the concept of evil, because the way I think we would generally default think about this theologically is if it's evil, it needs to be destroyed.
Yeah.
And because one of the things you talk about in your book is just how vicious, and we could even go so far as to say at times violent, things have become, even with people who would tell you that they are Christians, but they start to endorse, whether it's in an online social media conversation or even actually out in the street of their community, they actually demonstrate levels of viciousness and at times violence that are just startling.
Yeah.
And I think I view a lot of this as an opportunity, because the culture has its eye on us. And Josh, if what you were saying earlier about how you would see people live one way on Sunday and another way on Tuesday on Facebook when they're talking about politics with the same brothers and sisters that they went to church with, what if that wasn't the case? Then how would our witness be magnified? There's a chance for Christians to press into, hey, we see a lot of racial tension and a lot of issues around that, but our church is multi-ethnic, and our church around the world, the global church, is multi-ethnic, and Jesus is the one that unites us. And that's a testament to Jesus's power. Same thing about politics. Like, we can disagree about politics, but look at how amazing Jesus is, that he overcomes even this divisiveness. Like, I see it as an opportunity for us to be able to step up and promote peace and joy, and that we find that in Jesus.
Yeah. At some point we should have a conversation just about the technology aspect of this, because I think it would be really helpful for people around social media.
Well, yeah, I just wanted to go there for a few minutes.
Yeah, we can if we have time.
Your thoughts, because we have a few more minutes for a couple of questions. Just talk about technology for a standpoint and how that is aiding and abetting or driving, or how it's influencing some of this conversation.
Yeah, well, I think one thing that was really helpful for me to understand when it comes to especially social media, but it also applies to these ad-based news websites and stations as well, is that if in a subscription-based news source, the product is the actual information. So you are paying for a service, they are delivering a product, which is news. In an ad-based scenario, like what you see on Facebook or what you see on some of the, clickbaity news websites, you are the product. Mm-hmm. So we don't always get this, right? We think, oh, I'm going there and they're providing me a news service. No.
Yeah, see, even when you say it, I don't get it. So you have to explain it to me.
So like normally when you buy a product, you pay money and are handed a product, correct? Right. We think with Facebook, who are you paying? You're not paying anybody, right? It's a free service. That should be a red flag there.
Right.
No. Because nobody is giving you a free product on Facebook. What's happening with Facebook is that the advertisers are paying Facebook for a product and Facebook is delivering you. So because
the one thing I am paying is attention.
Yes.
That's right. That's right.
You are the end product because those advertisers want you to change your behavior either through what you're buying, what you're subscribing to. So they're trying to get money out of you.
Let me see if I can frame this in the way that I'm hearing you. Okay. Which is, what you're saying is Facebook comes and says, or Instagram or the others comes to this group of advertisers who have products they want to say, look, I can give you what you most want, which is I can deliver to you the attention of this large number of people. You pay me X dollars and I will bring you their attention.
That's correct.
Mm-hmm. And by the way, if you're following a Facebook group that's about motorcycles, okay, I'm pretty sure they can give advertisers that information as well.
Absolutely.
Right. So Harley Davidson knows to put an advertisement to you, targeted to you specifically.
Right. Yeah. So Harley Davidson is shopping on Facebook going, I'm looking for this type of person. This is who I'm trying to buy today.
I don't know why that came. Why?
That's great. We'll use it. We'll roll
Harley Davidson is saying, I'm looking for the 59-year-old midlife guy who looking for some fresh fun, and we're going to introduce him to motorcycles.
Yep. So they go, we actually have that for sale today. Here's this group of people that you can reach with your advertisement. And so that person comes onto Facebook thinking that they are getting a service from Facebook when in fact they are the product. And so why that's important is to know what people are trying to do. What is Facebook trying to do? They are trying to keep you on Facebook as long as they can. And the way they do that is by presenting content to you that is going to capture you, right? And so, what we've talked about already, the content that's going to capture you is the stuff that is triggering that fight or flight response.
Right.
That's why there's been so much stuff in so many conversations around trying to get Facebook and other social media platforms to kind of moderate what kind of content is on there, because they know that Facebook is actually exacerbating this anger problem and this division problem, because they make more money when they can keep you on there longer and serve you to more advertisers. So just as a general kind of rule of thumb for people, which I think it was helpful for me at least, but if you are using a service that is free, you are the product as a general rule. And so, and again, what that means is that they are not trying to serve your best interest. They are trying to serve the advertiser's best interest. So it's different with like there's a difference between like a New York Times, which obviously we know they're political leaning, but they are a subscriber-based news source. There's a very different type of content delivery there than there is on some of these other sites that are ads running all the way down the screen. The ones that you're going to see on your Facebook feed, things like that are coming up using ads. There's a very different approach there and a different business model altogether. And so just really important. I just recommend people, if you are trying to figure out how to engage with the news, especially digitally, to find a couple reputable sources that you can actually pay a subscription to. And what you're doing is you're not becoming a product that's getting manipulated to serve somebody else's purpose.
So you're actually freeing up that news source to operate in a different way.
Correct.
That might serve your interests better.
Correct.
So Josh, in the last few minutes that we have here, where does your book land in terms of hope in things like that and other things that you say, hey, we should approach this biblically from this standpoint? I think we'll be healthier.
The first thing we've already talked about, which is just we need to right size politics.
Right. Know its limits. Yeah.
Regardless of who wins the election, they're not in control. No. They have that individual has their limits. Our government has its limits. And as we've seen, all sorts of world events can change the course of not only our nation, but the world. Yeah. So our hope cannot be in our government. Our hope cannot be in a political leader. They will fail us. Even if we get our way, they will fail us, and they're not as powerful as we think we are. So especially as believers, we have to first remember that it is God who's in control. Okay. And even if we don't get our way, even if the person we want doesn't get elected, our hope doesn't change.
And the truth is that if any of us got to be king for a day, we would disappoint ourselves.
Yeah.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah. And then from an internal peace standpoint, another thing I really recommend people do is disable all notifications on your devices. So like, if you have the CNN app or the Fox News app or even New York Times, whatever, those, if you have notifications turned on your phone, they have control over your attention. They decide when you're engaging with them instead of you deciding when you engage with them. So you're giving any app that you allow notifications on, you are giving them power to interrupt your life, interrupt your inner peace, interrupt what your daily walk. And so I'd highly recommend, especially if you struggle to walk in peace in like political seasons like this, make sure you're not allowing notifications on your devices. If you want to find a time you want to read the news and go read it, find the time you want to engage and let that be the time and turn it off. So I have by default just about everything turned off on my phone in terms of notifications. So I choose when I want to engage with the news. And if it's too much, I turn it off, and when I'm ready to engage again, I will, instead of them controlling that. Again, I don't want to be the product. I want to have choice and autonomy over when I'm going to engage in that. And then the third thing I really encourage people to do is to find some way to take action. So one of the things that can be so frustrating in seasons like this is you can feel a bit helpless to make any kind of difference or any kind of change, and even if you're in a state that leans real far one way or the other, even your vote can feel kind of useless at times.
Sure. Yeah, sure.
But we have the ability to actually step out and take action. And if abortion is your issue, you can probably make a more tangible difference in actually going and serving somewhere than you can with your vote.
Go find a clinic to help with, or some other, become a part of the advocacy arm of it, whatever the case might be.
Time, talent, treasure, right? You can use your time, you can use your talents, your skills, and you can use your money. Maybe you don't have the time or the talents, but you have, you can help support a ministry that does, or vice versa. And so, what we don't want is for us to feel hopeless and feel like we have no stake in this. We are the hands and feet of Jesus. We are salt and light in this world. And so we can't just sit back on our computer screens or on our phones and go, man, the world is going to pot, No. I hope it doesn't get,
Hope it doesn't come here.
Yeah, totally. It's okay, how can I, as a representative of Christ, make a difference? And maybe that's with our neighbor, maybe that's with our family, maybe that's with our church. But us taking some sort of action gives us back some autonomy again, and being able to do something.
I love what you're saying there. Is I've heard people talk about what you can do is the stuff that you can do right outside your front door and inside your own family to help reweave community.
Yeah.
We keep, and you guys have probably heard this before, we have now started arguing about and dividing ourselves up over big national and global issues that we really can't know that much about or do that much about unless and until God might put us into some of those environments. But we brought that into the local level.
Right.
And it's discouraged us that almost all hope is lost. When what you're saying, Josh, is look, go volunteer at your church and work with teenagers or work with kids or go to this part of your community and get involved and help make your community better.
Right.
And then it will be better.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. We're not victims in this.
We're not
right?
We don't have to be victims of all of this. We actually we have agency and we can become involved. And then the other part of that reminded me as well of something is what you feed yourself. In the last 6-7 months, I've gotten a lot more joyful by not watching the evening news as the last thing before I go to sleep,
yeah.
which is Something I learned from my parents, right? Well, you just don't go to sleep till you watch the 10 o'clock news. And why would you do that when it's largely negative and almost all my sports teams lose anyway? So, why do they always end with sports, which is what that's the carrot they hold you out to. Yeah. And then basically most of the news about my teams is bad. So why would I want to go to sleep on that?
Yeah.
And and why would I want to be restricted to 10 o'clock when I can get news anytime I want it? So why don't I choose instead of letting them choose for me?
It's important to do that little bit of reflection, kind of do an audit of what's bringing me peace, what's making me more Christ-like, and then what on the other side is creating anxiety, making me not love my neighbor more. Yeah. That you'll find certain things that are fruitful and certain things that aren't, and make changes. You know, I've had to do the same thing. Especially during, the first year of the pandemic, was watching a lot of news, and it created a lot of anxiety. Once I took that out of my routine, like, oh, life isn't so bad. Yeah, right. Maybe things are going to be okay. Yeah. It's amazing when you start to just notice how certain things are affecting your mind and your heart, how you can make adjustments and walk more in peace.
Yeah. And we're not saying to just completely walk away from it.
That's
That's not what any of us, we're all for talking about these things with thoughtfulness and humility. And it's interesting what you talk about is mostly it's obedience. Like going out and serving in your community in some way, or loving your neighbors in a tangible way, is not optional. Like, that's obedience to the Lord. And so those are some really great thoughts. Yeah. Thank you for sharing that.
Not surprisingly, ought to bring us peace and joy. Right. So move toward those things, right? Obedience always does that.
Yes.
Right. And makes us more secure as well. Guys, thanks for the conversation here on the Denison Forum. You can find this podcast wherever podcasts are available. Please rate, review us, and share this with others. And you'll find Josh's book, Peace in Politics, in the show notes. You can click on the digital link and download it that way. And guys, again, thanks for being a part of the conversation today.
Yeah, my pleasure.
Thanks, Mark.